The state of healthcare is in such a crisis.
We have to make this decision soon on, do we hold the standard of performance or what a technology or tool offers against and in its own category, or compared to what the performance is today?
Sanjay, you just have an incredible story.
I started posting my chief fellow year. The whole purpose was to empower patients to be able to be their own best advocates when we know gaps exist for certain things in cancer. That led to close to 1 million followers and all this stuff.
I'm curious where you think are the 2 or 3 biggest shifts that are going to happen very soon for the everyday oncologist.
I think there's going to be these very subtly integrated pieces of the clinical workflow for a physician that just starts happening.
If you think the hardest problems in cancer care are purely biological, this conversation points to a different set of challenges. In this episode, I talked to Dr. Sanjay Juneja, a practicing oncologist and educator that you've likely seen across social media or on TV as the Onc Doc. He's built an audience of nearly 1 million people by translating oncology for the real world. And from my view, Dr. Juneja asks uncomfortable questions with real rigor and empathy. First, we talk about what drives physicians to educate outside traditional channels and what that really says about the gaps in the system. Then we look at how AI may change who gets access to knowledge and how to get it without replacing clinical judgment. We also explore the philosophy of adoption, why some AI tools feel intuitive and trusted, and while other tools never really quite land. This conversation reframes influence, adoption, and progress in modern cancer care. Let's dive in. Sanjay, you just have an incredible story. I wonder if we can start with just sharing a little bit more with the audience about, who you are and, how you got to where you are today.
No, I appreciate so much you having me. And it is definitely unique and serendipitous, so to speak. But then when you really kind of peel back the layers, it's not. And it started with shortly into community practice. My wife and I are both oncologists. Was just recognizing, a lot of these gaps, for lack of a better term. I know it's used a lot, but there's guidelines that update like crazy. Cancer treatment is evolving, and staying on top of it can be challenging, especially when it's multidisciplinary, because you have indications of when you need surgeons, when you need radiation. Having these guidelines transform can be a challenge, let alone the medical oncology, which is the stuff about the tumor. All of that to say, I started posting my chief fellow year. My wife had started practice with the kids a year before me. And at first it was dancing, and I got a bunch of, followers on a video or two, and felt a little uncomfortable with it. In my culture, we believe in evil eye, or something called nazar. So you need to do a good thing or a good purpose if you're going to get attention. And so it started with just cancer education. The whole purpose was to empower patients, or just inform them to be able to be their own best advocates when we know gaps exist for certain things in cancer. Again, because of the way the system is, there's not enough oncologists, all these reasons. It never hurts to have both the patient participating and the physician, kind of discuss a top of level, discussion and management. And then that led to whatever the stats are, close to 1 million followers, and downloads and all this stuff. And the transition for me happened about 2 years ago when I realized that, hey, those same reasons that we needed to educate on social media, those can actually be neutralized with what AI, and specifically generative AI, can bring us, both as physicians as well as oncologists. Because now we don't have this sea of information that you have to have knowledge to sift through. With generative AI, as you know better than anybody, and these LLMs, I can be assisted to sift through a plethora of information. So as a physician in a family, you're able to do that. And that's what really brought me to AI, was how can we make sure it's done responsibly? And then also, what usually happens, given to the providers and physicians as well, rather than all of us catching up, way after something is out, DTC, so to speak.
Yeah, it's super interesting because, I think healthcare never before really had this moment where there's this real opportunity to reimagine the way things are done. And I think starting with your story about patient empowerment, really making a lot of these guidelines more accessible, not only to the physicians, but also to the patients in entertaining ways where, people can actually understand them and feel comfortable bringing that to their physician. Now we have this moment where, hey, like rather than relying on the diffusion of information, you can actually leverage technology to help do a lot of this inference that I think is very difficult for a human to really comprehend. What we spend our time thinking about a lot at DeepScribe is, okay, how do we get this technology out there? Right? How do we get this into the hands of the everyday physicians? And I'm curious with your work, like if you can share some of the learnings that you've had of, how do you, get these this technology into the hands of the everyday physician? Is it about education? Is it about workflow integration? What really is it?
I mean, I think like anything at first, and it's not enough by itself, but at first, the value prop or value proposition has to be there. Like, what is the reason that we're going to even have this conversation at all, let alone to potentially introducing it? And so that value proposition is very important. But I'm sure you've seen more than anybody. It's like, okay, that's nice or that sounds great, but then the next step is like, what is the learning curve or the interruption in a workflow that I personally believe, that everyone believes they've mastered it and have it so much so done to a T that it's not worth deviating from, even for a week of pains because of the challenge of it. And that's the kind of technical integration, be it literally technical, right? Like where one practices, but even in just that workflow, when I go see a patient, I'm going through the chart. I know exactly what I'm clicking. I know what I want to click. I know what I want to see. My nurse practitioner knows what I want to see. And together we know exactly, how to put the tasks is what we call them in OncoEMR into the chart. Like all of this workflow is there. So I can't appreciate the value proposition of something that could be quicker because I believe, I don't believe that you know exactly what mine is. And I think the key there is making someone feel seen or heard, or in other words, be familiar. And I think you've talked about this concept before too, is there's a reason behaviorally and psychosocial kind of circumstances that there's this thought that people favor those that look akin in some way or some familiarity, even to not, if not akin, just in the facial distribution. And that's because we naturally gravitate to the familiar. And I think that is a more simple way of putting it. It's not just what can it offer for you, but does it offer something that you are familiar with?
I feel like the way that AI has been characterized historically has always been kind of like this evil force, right? Especially if you look at sci-fi, you look at AI is taking over the world. You have movies like iRobot, where these robots become sentient and they start taking over humanity. And I think that there is this kind of doomsday stigma around AI that when you start sharing that AI can actually help you, there's obviously a lot of skepticism when it comes to that. And I feel like we at DeepScribe have learned this firsthand. One of the things that as technologists we've thought initially was, hey, like our job is just build the best technology. And if we build the best technology, we build an AI that can write the most medically accurate note. Everyone's going to love this. Everyone's going to adopt this, and this is going to be like this new world that can be created. But the hard lesson that we learned was that we built what we believed was a really really accurate AI system. Turns out that wasn't the biggest lever to driving adoption of our tool. Instead, it was being able to really customize the language model to the individual provider so that the note that is produced looks like something that they would have otherwise written themselves. And it was not so much about the clinical content, it was really about the formatting, the words that you choose, the pronouns that you refer to the patient as. And those are the things that when we were able to accommodate, they were like, wow, this is actually saving my time. It's really interesting how, in healthcare, it's not just the value proposition. Because I think, the value proposition around, helping patients heal, helping patients find cures, that's it's altruistic, right? But when you think about the nitty gritty of like, okay, how do you actually get there? There's so many challenges just in integrating with the clinical workflow that physicians that are so busy spend all their day doing 20 years, familiarizing themselves with too. And then all of a sudden you ask them to change. That's really kind of the hump that, is difficult to get over.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you say that about the technical, have the best technology. I was sharing with a friend the other day. It's the same thought behind a phone, right? Your cellular device. Like you could tell a lot of people this phone is better. And believe me, I have friends that do not have iPhones that are not iPhone users that tell me that this is the best technology. but I still have an iPhone, right? And I think many people would remain to
Me
have that
too.
iPhone. Not exactly, not because of the technology necessarily superiority, but because of that familiarity. And I think if you were to map out how the features from either or both, and this is the same for TVs or anything, there's a reason they kind of start looking like each other, because I think for that crossover you also need that familiarity. And that's why the value prop could be, hey, say for ambient listening, it's like there's something that can save you time in your notes, but it doesn't feel necessarily familiar until it looks and feels familiar, which is those same pronouns or that same structure, the way the assessment and plan is written. Now it's like, okay, I can get on board with that. The same way as some phones need to have somewhat of a UI that's like, okay, that's not so much of a leap.
Yeah. And I think it's going to be, an ever more important topic because, I think today a lot of the conversation is still largely revolving around, what can this technology do? How do you develop the right evals to ensure, trust and accuracy? How do you put the right guardrails in place? How do you give the right credentials? But, at a certain point, it really becomes, okay, this technology is, good 95% of the time, right? And it's at the point where, I would argue that it should become the standard of care, right? Like physicians that have these AI tools that are, assisting them in their care are practicing at the top of their license compared to physicians that aren't leveraging these tools. And then it really becomes, okay, how do you actually get people to use these tools? I think, we've had, instances in history where, you have government intervention with like meaningful use. But, I think we've seen, a lot more success stories, for example, like open evidence, where it's more of a kind of grassroots movement where physicians just really find something useful and, are going to use these tools regardless, right? And I think, as we think about the technology diffusion in healthcare, I think soon the conversation is going to shift from what else can these tools do to, okay, these tools can do everything, but how do we actually get people to actually use them, right?
Yeah, and I believe like the next step after that, believe it or not, if we can achieve that, is them starting to ask where's the tool for X, Y, and Z. Because once you've been in a sandbox and once you realize the concept of a large language model, what natural language processing can do on being able to retrieve stuff from your notes, that you're asking your best fellow or resident that chart preps well. Like now you're like, where's the thing that I can just dump that, you start to understand and appreciate the architecture of how, say something like this technology that's unfamiliar works. And now you're looking for it, just like we did with iPhones. We were like, where's the app for? But before, 2 years ago, it was like, what is an app? I don't want an app. I have to click another box. It's the same concept to that in that degree. And I think that participation element of being kind of immersed, not just using the technology, but really getting to appreciate it such that you're almost filling these gaps of where something could really be viable, is a shift we're going to see that's going to be a little bit more unique than other technologic advancements we've had.
Yeah. I think the natural adoption curve really is like, how do you automate or streamline work that, exists today, right? Like documentation is a great example. And that really is kind of a Trojan horse to the future because once people start, realizing that it can automate work that they're familiar with and they can already do, you start asking this yourself, what can this technology help me do that I wasn't able to do yesterday? Right. And it starts, emerging these new frontiers of, I think what we've talked about a lot is like, how can it surface information that the physician, either knew but just forgot or wasn't even aware of at all.
Exactly.
I think that's a good segue to kind of my next question of like, there's a lot of technology out there, and I think you're sitting in a very interesting vantage point, right? Like as an oncologist, as an influencer, as somebody that works in real world data and precision medicine, you're seeing a lot of these technologies emerge. I'm curious where you think are like the two or three biggest shifts that are going to happen very soon for the everyday oncologist? Like, what are those apps that you said that are going to emerge next that are really going to change the way, medicine is practiced?
I may go uh, a little from left field here and say, instead of picking one big idea that requires some kind of transformational change, I think it's going to be something a little more passive or disguised. And I'll give you an example. When we start when our iPhone, I keep going back to the iPhone, but like when our iPhones update or our Macs or whatever, tech we're using, we'll sometimes see something that we're just like, oh, that's kind of nice. Like we don't know where it came from. We didn't really download it, but like all of a sudden it's gonna, add the date of something from an email. Would you like to add it to the calendar? I'm like, oh, well, yes, I will. Like, rather than me having to create the event all the time. Or when it's starting to know about what time I'm like winding down. There's a lot of this subtle, rather advanced technology that comes that we are using effortlessly or seamlessly, and just almost recognizing its absence when we go to an older model or this and that, and not even realizing they're here. I mean, if you would have told somebody that there was no keypad, an actual keypad to a phone, like they would have been like, that is inconceivable. Like there's no way. And it's like subtly, we have no keys on a phone. And it's
Yeah.
not even strange. Right. So I think that if we're sitting a year from today in 27, I think there's going to be these very rather subtly integrated pieces of the clinical workflow for a physician, like how we get in, how we're doing this, that's just starts happening. I mean, this better than anybody, but like, when my wife first used, and I'm not saying this to say it about DeepScribe, but I just still remember she came and she said, Sanjay, when I came and I sat down after my conversation, the first week that they were beta testing it, she was like, I just couldn't believe what it left out and what it knew to include. And like a lot, I was just so worried I'd have to read the whole thing and cut out all the stuff that had to do about Mardi Gras or whatever we were talking about. And she's like, but I didn't. And then she's like, and secondly, it really kind of nails stuff I need to follow up on. And the thing that I found significant about that. Number one, I said, "Oh, well, who was the company?" Because like I needed to know. And then, but secondly, it's the fear of also the additional work that comes with something that's supposed to be easy. Because she specifically said, "I thought I had to go back and then filter out." And when that's the pleasant surprise was when you didn't. So that's another one of these examples of this almost like subtle integration, which I would call the sealant of like a validation or confirmation that is less rigid than switching to a smartphone, then switching from a Mac to a PC. I think it's going to be the subtlety of it all. Now, with all that said, you're probably like, okay, well, give me something really big. I think, especially with the advent of what's called foundation models, where we can have multimodal data where you have all the pieces and components about a cancer patient, like the profile, that characteristics of the tumor, their germline mutations, what meds they're on, what comorbidities they have, and then you have the outcome and longitudinal data, which is like who got a toxicity to a drug, who ended up progressing, who didn't, who had an unusual response, who had a response that they were supposed to have and didn't. You can put all this stuff in, and in a foundation model, unlike just traditional data where you just get biostatisticians and kind of crack everything you can in sub cohort analyses. On foundation models, you can start using AI or machine learning, and of course, with human input, all these different potential algorithms or learnings that may apply to certain subgroups. And I think we're going to start seeing that we can start to split the hairs of all of those suboptimal responses that we incur moral injury for as oncologists. All those guarded excitements for things in case you're in the minority. Like all of this behavior where we know everyone has to fit on that one, utensil or that one use case. Instead, we can actually have a better idea. And to me, that's like a real precision medicine, which I wish wasn't a term before, because I think we're going to enter a whole new advent of precision where it's like a 1.0 to 2.0, kind of distinction that you'll have to make. And I think it's largely because of fortunately or unfortunately, because of AI and because of technology and because of what you can crunch with large volume sets today.
I think the point that you made about the subtlety is so key. One of the kind of mottos that I tell my team is the devil's in the defaults, right? And what I mean by that is magic. When you use a product and you feel magic, it's because it knew something about you that you didn't tell it, right? And it just knew, and it just works so seamlessly. Like that's what I want, right? And it's just like all I have to do is say
Yes.
yes. I don't have to tell you what I want. It just knows what I want.
Like autocorrect, like how that almost just came in, right? Like autocorrect and all these other, like, exactly. Like to your point, it's just these things that just immediately happen.
That capability, it's so hard to contain, right? Because I think before with classical NLP techniques, predictive models, before the advent of LLMs, it was very difficult to do that inference at scale, right? Like how does, Dr. Juneja like his notes, right? That's a very difficult problem to answer, before the advent of LLMs. And what we've been able to do is really build models at the individual provider level so that we know, hey, like based off of all the notes that they've written, here's the information that they captured, here's how they wrote it, here's the order that they put it in, and whatever we produce should look exactly like all these other notes. Albeit sometimes, doctors tell us, hey, I don't want you to train my model using my notes because my notes are bad. And I want actually you to train my model using, Dr. Juneja's notes because I really like the way his notes look, right? But the fact that you're able to generate that familiarity right off the bat without having to ask them, right? Like, what do you want about your notes? Is what we've been able to kind of create that magic from. And I think, slowly these tools, with high levels of adoption, they'll start to emerge into kind of that reality that you were talking about with your second point with precision medicine being able to be delivered at scale. Because, one of the things that I'm kind of noticing in the industry is that there are almost like two archetypes with provider organizations deploying AI, right? You have one archetype where they're moving fast and breaking things, right? Like typical startup mentality, like let's try all these vendors, pilot them for 30 days and like see what works. And it's really awesome because you're able to see them, iterate and test and validate, new AI tools. And, it's actually providing a significant impact to the practice. The other archetype is that, hey, they're moving slowly, but they're moving deliberately, right? And it's interesting because, for me, I'm usually the person that's like, let's move fast and break things. Right. But if I think about the reality that creates is you end up with a lot of different vendors, offering point solutions in the overall AI stack. Right. And I think in order to really affect that reality that you described, where you're able to pull context from all these parts of the value chain, from all these areas of the patient journey, and all these signals from all the doctors that are involved in that patient's care, and you're able to use that context to inform the next step or to inform the next part of the value chain. You really need to build an infrastructure that allows the model to share that context. And if you have kind of a stack where you have all these different vendors, it becomes very difficult to really affect that change. So, while you show, this really, really spiky, you know, progress at first, you might end up with, less of the value that could be captured versus, how do you just build it more deliberately and figure it out, where are the key context points where I need to be shared throughout the value chain?
You nailed it. Do you think it's too late? I mean, is it already too late to, I think to pivot? I think a lot of people that are the naysayers is because of this culture of just a gazillion point solutions. I'll tell you, some providers say that I got 10 DeepScribe options, I got 10, this and that, and I don't know what I mean. We're not on a federated data sharing model. Like, is it too late?
I don't think it's too late. I think we're at the point right now where, some practices are, using different vendors across revenue cycle or across research, across, documentation. But I think what we're building is like we eventually view Ambient as this operating system that's able to kind of ingest information from the EHR, ingest information from the conversation, and then match that with data that's outside of the conversation. So whether it's guidelines or pathways, or whether it's research and clinical trials, whether it's, quality programs or support programs, and then figure out, a timely way to inject that back into the workflow. And then, depending on whether or not it's accepted, we can then, streamline the work that is done to all those stakeholders at the end, right? So there's a bit of push and pull, right? And in one sense, we're not ready for that. We haven't built out all those applications. So, it's very difficult for me to say, these practices should be adopting everything from DeepScribe. On the other hand, right, like, I was talking to a very, very large, oncology network, and they were saying, 2025 was the year of the pilot, right? And 2026 is kind of the year of the optimization and consolidation. And so, I don't think it's too late, but I do think that, they need to start thinking about the infrastructure of AI as like a strategic decision rather than just pursuing AI for this, for the short term like dopamine hits of showing kind of success.
I mean, one thing that comes to mind when you talk about this kind of larger scale concept of customization is I was shocked yesterday when I was talking to a buddy that's at Stanford, and they were talking about how when it comes to cancer patients, and we have to deliver steroids for like immune therapy, toxicity, or for any lymphomas, usually or most lymphomas, they were like, think about the time that's lost to go have to go see an endocrinologist. And then when they expanded, they said, if you say you're going to refer a patient to the endocrinologist, they're like, the time it takes for the referral team member in your clinic to call the clinic, gather all the information they need, make sure you have that information, those labs done and stuff, and then actually schedule you, you lost time for the patient. And I said, I was shocked. I was like, that's your time crunch? I'm like, our time crunch is that it's 2 to 3 months before you can see the endocrinologist. So it was a completely different context of, days lost before starting the therapy for lymphoma, but the impossibility of not being able to start wait to start therapy for lymphoma because it's our diabetic endocrinologists are oversaturated. So you could imagine how if there was an ambient learning, how even that in a conversational context, if you were to say, hey, we're going to send you to a diabetes specialist because we're going to get your sugar super high and we don't want to hurt your kidneys, it means two different things. So when you're approximating it, down to the bottom of the assessment and plan, one is doable in a week or two. You see them back and you can start your therapy. The other one is in lieu of the fact that we can't start therapy, like until like we have to start now, not 2 months. Like the entire flow changes. But
Exactly.
it's like you would like I didn't have to prompt it, I didn't have to teach it. It's just if you have an entire institution of physicians, and especially when they're like, it looks like the appointments in, so and so, weeks or months, it's intelligence now that's able to learn about even the times these kind of things takes. A PET scan, for example. Sometimes we have to push back appointments because there's just not a PET scan available, which is a completely never problem in other places. So it's a very interesting concept that really kind of pairs well with this idea of just ambiently, no pun intended, starting to come into our lives in a convenient manner. Like that's the key, is that
Yeah.
it's so convenient. Like you almost it would be weird to not have it.
Yeah. And it's like, I think it's being like having one system or the infrastructure that is able to share that context between the systems allows the system to telegraph what the next steps are and like basically have zero latency. Like that was a great example that you just used and say, hey, we heard that you want to schedule time with endocrinologist. We looked at the patient management system. They don't have availability for the next 2 or 3 months. Send that back to the doctor before the patient leaves and say, hey, by the way, when that patient leaves, they're not going to be able to see an endocrinologist in 2 to 3 months. Do you want to change like your plan,
Oh my
right?
gosh.
And those are like the instances where that context really, really matters, right?
And right now it's all text. Right now it's like, hey, that patient you just saw in room 12, they can't, whatever. What do you want to do? Do you want to? And I'm wasting, like, we're wasting time every day saying, like, well, I guess just push them back a week. That's a holiday. We're literally going back and forth on text with three people waiting in the room. And this just, it's just so interesting to think now of what an introduction of technology in real time could do to alleviate even something as simple as that.
Yeah. And I think the interesting part is that like, I think the conversation and the use cases that we just discussed, again, I think it's streamlining work that's done today, right? And in the sense that it's telegraphing work that, is a standard operating procedure that we can find in some sort of documentation, embed that into as an agent into the system and, you know, tail that out, right? But if you start thinking about, okay, like, we're recording these conversations at scale, right? Like, what is the information that we're capturing that, that physician otherwise wouldn't have captured with respect to social determinants of health, right?
Totally.
What are some of the preferences of the patient, right? What are some of the adverse events of that patient? And, if someone's saying, hey, like, we're going to put this patient on an oral, but, the patient has previously said that, they have trouble with oral medication. And those are things that like the doctors don't, sometimes forget in the treatment. So it's not just like being like pathway concordant, it's also figuring out how do you provide more holistic picture of the patient with some of the additional data that you're capturing.
I mean, it's kind of like the concept of most people buy an electric car, a self-driving car, or are interested in one because they don't have to drive. But what ends up happening in the sub layer is like there's a lot fewer accidents and stuff. So there's this holistic thing that happens in places and areas that are more accident prone. This and that just completely gets lowered even though you didn't go into that saying, hey, we'll have less accidents. It was because you're self-driving. And I'll give you one more with the familiarity. I've never had a Tesla or a self-driving car. I have a bad habit of older vintage cars that break down. And so I'm thinking about or having to get another one. And then I never thought about Tesla until a friend of mine said, it's great because my wife and I do emails every time we drive an hour away. Now, when he said that, and I think about the load of emails I always have and get angst about catching up on, suddenly that made me interested. Not because the self-driving part, like I know it's because you're self-driving. I knew self-driving cars existed, semi-self, whatever you want to call it. But it was just that familiar, tangible piece of a concrete, granular example of a way my life could change indefinitely for every time I'm driving that all of a sudden brought value. And I think that's a real big concept that, technology or technology companies and enterprise needs to think about. It's like you have to bring it back to something relatable, and that's an asset or a commodity of sorts. Going through emails is that for me. The technology I understand, but I'm not going to extrapolate it. You have to hold my hand to get there.
Yeah. It's the classic kind of Steve Jobs, Apple, like versus Windows marketing, right? It's like, oh, like, we have 32, gigabytes of RAM, memory, and then we have like 8 gigabytes of RAM. And it's like, what does that
What does
mean?
that mean?
Oh, like I can watch movies for 8 hours. Like, oh, okay, that's really what I want. Or like, hey, I can, play these games with all these better graphics. That's really what I want. Right. And it's like, I think
Exactly.
technology needs to, get down to that rating level, right? And say, hey, like this is really the value that it creates. And it's crazy because, one of the things that we think about a lot is the state of healthcare is in such a crisis, right? You have the rising cost of care, you have the increasing shortage of physicians. And if we don't do something about it soon, it's all going to come crashing down, right? And I think we've been given a lifeline with this technology. And there is kind of like this real urgency that I see from the outside looking in that needs to be adopted. And it kind of leads me to kind of the next question, which is really like, I see what these technologies can do. And yes, right, like these technologies need to further be refined. There needs to be, the right governance process, there needs to be the right guardrails put in place, etc. But at what point do these technologies really become mandatory, right? Or really become, really part of the standard of care that needs to be provided rather than just some sort of discretionary tool that can be adopted. And you brought up the idea of the self-driving cars, and I think we're kind of seeing it play out, right? You know, I think that a lot of times people hold technology and AI to a higher standard than they hold themselves or than they hold their peers. When self-driving cars came to San Francisco, everyone was a little bit skeptical about them. But once they got into the car their first time, they're like, this is way better than an Uber. Like I would rather trust my kid going into a Waymo than dropping them off at school than having them put into an Uber with a stranger.
Right.
And, I think there's still this like heavy regulation around driverless cars in San Francisco today, where they're like really slowly starting to expand their coverage area. But, if you look at the data, right, like Waymo just published data around their safety rating. And for like every 7 million miles, they had like zero point zero 0.06 injury related accidents. And if you compare that to a human driver, they had about like 2.6 or 2.7 injury related accidents for a million miles. And it's like these driverless cars are already 5 times safer,
It's like orders of
than
magnitude. Yeah.
their human equivalents. When do we start saying as a society, like, hey, like, let's get all the Ubers out of San Francisco and driving Waymos? And, that's a little bit of a, hyperbolic statement, but, I think it makes the point pretty clear, especially in healthcare where there's such a, immediate crisis. When do these tools really need to be kind of looked at as compulsory? Right.
We have to make this decision soon, collectively, as a human race or a scientific community, on do we hold the standard of performance or what's a technology or tool offers against and in its own category, as you're saying, or do we hold it to a standard or compare it to what the performance is today? be it human or not. And most of it is human. So, in the scientific community, we're very used to these kind of p values and confidence intervals of seeing numbers like 95%, et cetera. At the same time, there's a ton of research and publications that show, the performance of ordering a low dose CT lung cancer screening test for a patient that qualifies, which has a significant improvement in survival of this patient population, is still only like 15-20%. Whereas every other type of screening, which is less, is about 70 to 80 to 90%. So it's like, that's just an error that we just tolerate. Same with certain mutations or molecular testing you're supposed to check on cancers that can have profound benefits. We know it's like 70-80% when you take the average. If this technology or AI is able to do either of these things at 85% or 90, like, are we going to say, okay, it needs to be performed at 98 and we're going to tolerate a 45 or 15% success rate until it's at 99, knowing what's lost in the timer process? Or do we allow that to say it's better than what we have today, keep working on it and iterating it? And it was going to those two archetypes that you were talking about. The first one is like, it's not even just like figure it out, see if it works. It's like, we know it works. We know it works better than what the current status quo is. But apparently, it's not good enough, even though it's better to what we have. And that, maybe I made that sound rhetorical. I don't know. I can't even pretend to know because I'm not a biostatistician and that kind of specialist. But I can tell you that people do suffer with the things that I mentioned, that we know that could be done, or performed at a better level. I think one part of it, and you'll have to forgive me with, philosophy majors, like, I think part of it is just inherently that knowing humans are fallible by being human, because we are human, there is a tolerability that is far higher than the fallibility of something we create. And I think there's some philosophical thought there. It goes back to the same thing of like, if one self-driving car saves, make it up a number, 1 million lives, but God forbid it went through one day a park and 3 children passed away, it's like, throw it all away. 3 million lives doesn't matter. Like, it saves compared to, doesn't matter. Like, we're still going to feel that way. And I don't mean that to say anything one way or the other as well, but I think at least considering that fact is something, when this consortium comes together, that I'm saying needs to make a conclusion or decision at some point. Like, it's worth thinking about.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I think, at the end of the day, technology diffusion happens at, like the individual account level or the individual physician level where, in healthcare, you need to make it through all these committees. The liability of these, tools ultimately falls on the provider organizations, et cetera. And so there's like this kind of almost like a economic tension, right? Of, hey, like, if the liability, of these tools and that those 3 kids at the park fall on me, right? That's very different than, us saving, 1 million lives as a community, right? So there's like this economic tension, and then there's a social tension where I think if you were to ask me that question, and maybe this is just, you can do your whole psychological analysis on me, but like, I'm saving those 1 million lives, right?
Right.
Like, it's just pure numbers, right? Like, if you have 1 million lives or 3 lives, we're saving the 1 million lives, right? And if it costs 3 lives to save the 1 million, then that's the cost that we have to pay, right? But it's interesting because it's like, how do we get the community to also adopt that mindset, right? And does it require government intervention? Does it require some sort of outside force that is pushing these individual provider organizations that have the accountability of making these decisions? How do we actually affect that change? It's a question that I can't really answer.
It's a great one. And sometimes I wonder if all of us as physicians and healthcare providers and everything are still patients too. Like, does this just come from the patient side? If it's going to be, government, if it's institutional, if it's statewide, whatever, like federal, whatever, it's like, as patients, do we want documentation, for example, in your case with DeepScribe, of what the conversation was. Do we want there to be guideline support or guideline, discrepancy or a highlight of that? Do we want to be able to document it, have it documented so that we could go back to it, or our referral specialist, or God forbid, our the emergency room doctor that we have to see, or critical care doctor, or trauma surgeon? That I think is an angle, because then at least, like, once it's not about what does this require cost of me, but how does this apply in my life, right? I save emails by getting a Tesla. Like, I think that's the way you make change. It's not by saying how instead it inconveniences or changes something that you're used to, like, professionally, but actually personally. And I don't know about you, but I haven't heard many conversations in that context yet, because it's tech world meets professional world, and patients are kind of just on the sideline rooting the team for the Super Bowl, when really it's like, do we have the wrong players? And it's like, should this conversation of what does and doesn't happen and to what degree happen with the entire population of spectators, which is all of us?
I always say that healthcare fails in two ways, right? Like the first way is ignorance, where the knowledge doesn't exist. And the second way is ineptitude, where the knowledge exists, but there's a failure for it to be applied. And I think,
That's the word.
historically, we've always put the burden of ineptitude on the physicians, right? Because they are the ones that are ultimately where the patients are coming to for their expertise, and helping them, come up with their prognosis, coming up with their treatment plan, et cetera. But we're at a really interesting time in society where, patients are actually, have the tools available to them to have that empowerment to be able to go into that room and say, no, like, I've actually done my research. What do you think about this? What do you think about this? What do you think about this? And we're starting to see that, right? Like, I think, we had Dr. Lydia Sapira, who is the director of the Stanford Cancer Survivorship Program, on. And she was like, one big change that I'm noticing is that patients are coming to me now with like a whole readout of ChatGPT of like, hey, ChatGPT said this, 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 and this. And she said, on one hand, it's concerning, right? Because, I don't know what information they're saying. And a lot of times the recommendations are crazy. And it's just like, when I go and, oh, I got a cut on my leg, and then I go on WebMD and find out I have cancer. And I, I go, it's like people like, I think, that can lead to a lot of issues. But she was like, there's something really special about that, where patients now feel like that empowerment to come to their doctor and say, hey, like, I actually know what you're talking about, or at least have a sense of it. And, I want to be involved in my care. And that might be, a big shift where the responsibility of the ineptitude no longer falls just on the physician, but also on the patients themselves, right?
Yeah. I mean,
So
it's like, it's the moral injury concept. It's like anything that goes wrong, and I can tell you my wife, like, we somehow feel guilty, right? Like, if the referral took 3 weeks to get the surgeon, you call everyone, they can't get them in, like, you still feel guilt, even if the outcome was favorable. It's like, I wish that surgeon, or you learn of something later, like the timing of immune therapy at our big conference worldwide called ASCO. We're like, wow, they were suggesting that the data they looked at said if you got in the morning, you had a much better, potentially response than you were if you're in the afternoon. And they explain it with science. Now you think back to every PM patient that you were giving immune therapy to. Did I participate in giving them not the best chance for their whatever? But if AI surfaces this and say, hey, the real world data shows us that for whatever reason, the patients that are between your 8 a.m. and 11 a.m. are getting responses, and at this rate, and the ones at PM, now we all are made aware. So the patient knows, I know, somebody's having a conversation. Do we want to start this earlier? That kind of brings us full circle to this whole concept of all of it. Really, it's like, it's subtle, it's real world data, right? Like, operationally or relevantly right in front of you at the interface. It's shared participatory trust of the machine learning, not necessarily maybe the literature is not. It, it, it's a change together. It's funny you mentioned the, hey, I can speak this language now at a doctor visit. What I would do to go into a mechanic, or an auto shop and be able to speak the language, right? Which I can't. So I'm at the mercy, because the same thing, in my humility, like, of being a physician and not knowing that medical space. I'm sure everyone now at this point is like, what cars are you getting and who are you buying them from? But it's a similar thing. Is that empowerment is probably, it's hard to not find a better word than to be empowered and to be participatory.
yeah. I mean, I think that future is coming, whether or not we like it, right? And I think being prepared for that future is really like, how do you start thinking about not just AI, but like integrating AI into the stack, into the clinical workflow, into the daily practice of medicine? It requires like a lot of, everything that we talked about on this show, right? It's, how do you drive adoption? How do you figure out how to share context where it matters? How do you figure out, how do you establish familiarity? How do you give that to the patients with the appropriate guardrails? All these things are like the real challenges that I think we need to be solved for us to kind of fix this situation or crisis, I would call it, that we're in healthcare. Because I think when healthcare breaks, it doesn't really break silently, right? It's just like it's one of those things where, wow, like that could have not happened, had I known, right? I think in the cases where, you could have known are going to increase with technology, and people are going to feel more and more behind of, oh my gosh, like had I not done this, had I not done that, you know, the sooner that we can get people involved in these decisions, involved in adopting AI into their workflows, the less, I guess, bad we'll feel. We'll
And moral
avoid that
engine.
outcome
Yeah,
where, we're sitting here in 10 years, and hopefully we're not saying, hey, we should have done this sooner, right?
exactly. It's like
Yeah,
hedging for yourself, like collectively as the human race. It's
yeah,
like the hedge is the trust of like not just having to bet on yourself to pull these things up. It's the same way in cancer. Why I started social media is like I was like, there's one tragedy of stubborn cancers where there are no treatments. Like glioblastoma is really stubborn, and pancreatic is still eluded us. I'm like, but there's a whole nother tragedy when you have a good drug and it was never used. That patient never saw it, but it existed. Whether the guideline wasn't expanded or worse, the guideline was that and applicable, but the physician didn't know about the update a week ago to check for it. So I think exactly the same is this concept of technology and doing it right. But that's why I'm grateful for people like you, Matt, and your team of like trying to find these solutions to not have to have us asking those questions.
yeah. It's hard. I feel like personally responsible, right? It's like when you see something, you're like, I need to do everything in my power to get this in the hands of everybody. But I'm also grateful for people like you that, are sitting on the other side of the table and also advocating for the same things, right? I know we're almost out of time. And the question that I like to kind of end the podcast with is really, what is one thing that you want technologists to know about oncology or about oncologists that you just wish they did, and you think that would help really lubricate or accelerate kind of what we discussed today, and vice versa, right? What is one thing that you really wish oncologists just understood about technology?
I mean, for better or for worse, I would say I wish technologists knew, or I hope that they know how discerning, and I don't want to say rigid, but definitely discerning oncologists like we are in general, because we have to be because of our cancer, like the cancer type and profile that we treat. And the devil's in the details is so very real for an oncologist. And so you could imagine how having that kind of speculative, exhaustive need and approach would require something to be either malleable or fit like a perfect glove. And I think the latter we can all say is hard to do. And so on the flip side, to answer your second question, I would like oncologists to know technology now isn't what it was like where you have what you have. Like when you got a TV, that TV is that TV. Or if I got something that was just purely coded, algorithmically or just written in traditional code, like it's going to perform like that all the time, every time, and I can make my decision about it. That is not the world of AI. That is not the world of iterations and reiterations and basically the malleability of what these tools, more complicated tools and their neuronal networks and their pathways that can differ is. So it doesn't have the rigidity and it has more elasticity than the way we think about technology traditionally, at least older people like me, which it was rigid. This is in a box, it comes out of the box, and this is what it's going to do all the time. And that's not the case. And you can
Yeah,
participate today more than you've ever been able to in the actual production and design of the very things that people in residency and fellowship today will be using. And you could ensure that they're using it to the best of the needs and pain points that you and I have experienced if you're listening to this today, because they need that insight. You need that insight. And I think that's the key, is that there's a very beautiful window right now to mold and shape these things to be the perfect love down the line.
I love that. I love that. Give it a chance, right? And it's improving so much faster. Like just you know, from GPT-3 to GPT-4, GPT-5, like the rate of improvement is something that we've never seen before. And, I always tell people you can't make a first impression twice. And I feel like, we need to change our thinking around that. As, for physicians, like they're so busy, they want to try something and for it to work immediately. And if it doesn't, then they'll never try it again. And that is going to be the biggest, loss for healthcare and society if we don't get around that fact. So,
Nailed it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. All right, Dr. Janeja, thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed the conversation today.
Likewise.
And yeah, I hope to see you in New Orleans sometime soon.
Yeah, we got to make it happen.